Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us for our second webinar of the Town Forest Recreation Planning webinar series. This webinar series is part of the Vermont Town Forest Recreation Planning Initiative, which includes an online interactive toolkit that offers everything you need to develop a town forest recreation plan in your community from start to finish. You can learn more about the project as well as the initiative and the toolkit at btcommunityforestry.org/town forest toolkit. My name is Kate Four, and I'm the Community Forestry Specialist with the Vermont Urban and Community Forestry Program. We have a number of friends of the program in attendance today, but for those of you who are new to us, the UCF team is a collaborative effort between UVM Extension and Vermont Department of Forest, Parks, and Recreation. And we as a program provide technical, education, and financial assistance to support communities in stewardship of their tree resources. You can learn more about our work at our website, vtcommunityforestry.org. Before I hand it over to our presenter today, I just want to go through a few logistics. Your microphones will be muted during the presentation, and there is no video option for participants. However, we do want to hear from you, so please use the question box in the side panel. Questions will be addressed as they come in throughout the presentation, and then we do have time reserved at the end of the webinar today for questions as well. This webinar is being recorded and will be available again at our website for later viewing. My colleague Gwen Kozlowski, who's joining me today in facilitating this webinar, will email out a link to today's recorded presentation to those folks who are registered for the webinar. At the end of the webinar today, you will receive a pop-up survey. Please take a few minutes to share your feedback on the webinar and provide suggestions for future topics so that we can plan more opportunities in the future that align with your needs. We are delighted to have you folks on the webinar today, and I think today's topic is one that I know I'm particularly super excited to hear about, and we've heard over the years from many of you folks that this is a topic that many of us are thinking about. And so we're very fortunate to have Katie Callahan, who is a GIS coordinator with New Hampshire Fish and Game Department. Before I hand it over to Katie, though, Gwen has a few questions for us through a poll. So Gwen, if you want to go ahead and launch the poll, that'd be great.
Absolutely. Good morning, everyone. Our first poll is, where are you located? We'll take a few seconds here to see where folks are distributed. All right, I'll go ahead and close this poll. We've got about 42% in Central Vermont, 20% in Northwest Vermont, a few from the Northeast Kingdom, a couple in Southern Vermont, and a few outside of Vermont. Our last poll is, what has been your most recent wildlife sighting or sign in your town forest? I just chose a few things here. Let's see, looks like a few people are voting. Great. I know mine was bear. I just got sandwiched in between two treat bears last week with my dog off leash, so luckily he came back. All right, we'll take another 10 or so seconds on this poll. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and close this guy. We've got 66% saying bears. A couple of folks have seen some amphibians. A few other people looks like they've seen some bears and porcupines, as well as deer and moose, and just a few fox and coyote. Well, thank you so much.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Gwen, and so fun to hear from you folks and know who's in our audience today. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Katie for the presentation. Thanks so much. And welcome, Katie.
Hi, thanks for having me today. I'd like to talk about our Trails for People and Wildlife, which is a project initiated, actually in the fall of 2017 over here in New Hampshire. And the interest was, we all like to get outside, hiking, mountain biking, bird watching. These are just some of the activities. We like to get out and enjoy nature and relax. And they may seem very low-key activities, but they can have a negative impact on wildlife. And so the purpose of the guide was to help landowners, conservation groups, natural resource professionals to develop a thoughtfully located network of well-maintained trails that still allow people to get outside while minimizing the disturbance to wildlife. The project was initiated through the Great Bay Resource Protection Partnership, and you'll see there are more logos up on the title slide here, besides just New Hampshire Fish and Game Department. The project was funded by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, with New Hampshire Audubon acting as the fiscal agent. And it is the mission of New Hampshire Fish and Game to encourage people to enjoy the outdoors, while also serving as the guardian for the state's fish, wildlife, and marine resources. And so we started by looking at what are the impacts of recreational trails on wildlife. These the disturbances may be short in duration, but cumulatively they can have long-term consequences. And so the impacts fall into 4 general categories. And as people move along a trail, the response by animals may not be obvious at first. There can be a physiological response, changes in the animal's heart rate, temperature, or stress hormones. The behavioral response is observable and can be measured. And these are changes to foraging, vigilance, or the animal becomes in an alert state. And as you get even closer, they will flee because humans are perceived predators. Our presence can also impact reproductive success. For example, as a bird leaves a nest when disturbed by humans passing by, that can result in just the number of eggs laid, the number of young that are born and successfully raised, and there can be direct predation on that nest. Scaring the adult away leaves the young vulnerable to that. And so we wanted to come up with a tool that can look at the impacts on existing trails. And so we started by looking at trails on protected lands, conservation lands in New Hampshire. And our presence can be detected by what's called a corridor of influence. And this is, wildlife detects our presence on either side of the trail as we're moving along. These distances are measurable. As I said, the behavioral response can be observed, and a lot of people have studied that, fortunate for us. And so we began by doing a literature review. We reviewed 67 articles. We tried to limit ourselves to New England-based or as close to New England as possible, so that both the wildlife, the suite of wildlife species and the types of habitat were similar to what we have here in New England. We found through the literature review that songbirds and reptiles and amphibians will flee from human presence at 60 feet. Birds will become alert to our presence at 150 feet, and mammals will become alert at 400 feet. So what does that look like? Well, that's about 1 1/3 football fields, or about 9 school buses stacked end to end. So if you can just picture yourself walking along a trail with 9 school buses lined up to your left and to your right, that's the impact that you're having on wildlife as you use that trail. And so we were curious to know how much impact our current trails are having on the conservation lands here in the state. New Hampshire is about 25% protected right now. About 30% of that area is impacted by roads and trails. And if we looked at an example, this is the town of Durham. in southeastern New Hampshire. We have both formal recognized trails, which are shown in red. We have the informal trails or social trails, you could also call them bootleg trails, shown here in yellow. And we also need to add roads to the mix because roads can also be recreational trails. We take all those three together and add that 400-foot buffer. And so for the town of Durham, that leaves the largest unimpacted area is just 0.8 square miles left that's not being impacted by the presence of trails. And just to put that in context, you know, a male bobcat will be about 15 square miles, a female bear about 10 square miles, a male bear can range up to 100 square miles. And it's not to say they aren't moving back and forth across the existing trails, but just to give you an idea of how this, you know, the perspective or scale of the impacts. And so we came up with this guide to help people plan trails while minimizing the disturbance to wildlife. We would not do that alone. We had a number of different partners, the Nature Conservancy, local land trusts, NRCS, Forest Society, and we approached it in two different ways. We wanted to, one, determine where best to locate new trails, and the second part was to help evaluate existing trail systems. We reached out to everyone we could possibly think of, including the New Hampshire Trails Bureau, which has a great publication that deals specifically with very trail construction and maintenance. And they recognize that just because a trail already exists doesn't mean that it's in a good location. Fortunately for us, there was a study done years ago in Colorado that looked at 5 key principles for minimizing trail impacts to wildlife. And those include keeping trails away from wet areas, not just for wildlife, but also from a maintenance perspective. Routing trails along habitat edges, avoiding known locations of rare species, and that's both animals and plants, and avoiding steep slopes. Similar to avoiding wet areas, avoiding steep slopes will also help minimize the amount of maintenance you need to do on the trail, and avoid special habitat types. And so looking at each one of these principles at a time, locating trails along habitat edges helps minimize fragmentation. And you may think, well, you know, we thought habitat edges were actually high diversity areas, and that is true, but it tends to be for more generalist species. And it's the specialist species, like the ovenbird shown here, which need intact areas of forest because they're a ground nesting bird. And so locating the trail along the edge, it may disturb those generalist species, but it's protecting the specialist species. So similar to the ovenbird, this would also help bobolinks and eastern meadowlarks, which nest in grasslands, or New England cottontails or whippoorwill, which are in shrublands. Here in New Hampshire, just last month, we recently completed the 2020 update to the Wildlife Action Plan data, which, among other things, maps special habitats, including pine barrens, shrublands, gravel pits, wetland areas, rocky ridges and talus slopes, exemplary communities, and very poorly drained soils. We also included a few that are not tracked species, and that would include, I mean, their populations are still sensitive, and so we included gray blue heron rookeries and cliffs with current or historic peregrine nests. The other key principle is to keep trails away from riparian areas. The flight distance for amphibians and reptiles averages about 60 feet. And so between 60 and 100 feet is the best distance to maintain to keep trails away from these sensitive areas. Avoiding steep slopes is important for animals like the bobcat, which dens in these areas, or the peregrine falcon on cliffs, or shown here, the small-footed bat, which tends to live on the scree slopes. And so we took all of these all can be represented as GIS or spatial data layers, and they can be sandwiched together in a co-occurrence map. And this was run statewide for the whole state of New Hampshire. We sought input from a number of different trail planning and building experts, wildlife biologists, the Park Service, the Forest Society, New Hampshire Trails Bureau, local land trusts, Trails Alliance groups. So we tried to bring to the table as many different people with different backgrounds and experience that we could find into a one-day workshop to review our preliminary model and just make sure that we've captured everything that needed to be included. And the result was a single raster data layer for the state, which you can think of as a heat map. And a heat map is just something that shows, so the blue areas are low impact to wildlife, and the red, as it gradually changes to red areas, those are having high impact. Those are sensitive areas. And so locating a trail there would have a high impact on wildlife. So we also wanted to make this information widely available, and I'm going to hopefully hop out of the presentation here momentarily and switch over to Granite View. I'll try to make this a little larger for you. This should look somewhat familiar because New Hampshire uses the same platform that Vermont does. So this should be somewhat similar to Vermont's A&R's Natural Resource Atlas, I believe it's called. So here in New Hampshire, it's called Granite View. The data layers for the trails model are available under our Environment and Conservation tag. And we have a wildlife grouping where we can see both the new 2020 Wildlife Action Plan. That includes habitat types. It includes the highest ranked habitat by relative condition. It also includes aquatic habitat features. And just below that, we have the planning trails for people and wildlife model. And this is the statewide heat map. I can zoom in here, and this allows people to view the results of the model. You can also turn on the trails. If I happen to find an area that has some trails, and if you don't see the trail that you're interested in evaluating, you can also upload your own trails data as a Google Earth, a KML file, shapefile, a Garmin GPX file from your GPS unit. Those can all be uploaded and overlaid on the trails model. Similarly, the New Hampshire Fish and Game website also includes just a more general description of the project, as well as a PDF copy of the entire guidebook, which I would invite everyone to check out. And I don't believe we have them hosted because I have not gotten a lot of requests, but if anyone today is interested in getting a copy of the literature review or even full PDFs of those sources, the 67 articles that we discovered during the literature review, I'm happy to share those at any time. There's also a GIS technical guidance document that describes how the spatial model was developed.
Katie, it looks like we have a couple of questions that have come in.
Sure, this would be a good time. Yep.
Oh, okay, excellent. We have a first question from John. Are the corridor of influence distances given the total width of the corridor or distances on each side of the trail?
So it's 400 feet on each side of the trail. So 800 feet total. If you think of the trail running up the middle of that.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. And then a question from Wendell looks like, is there a similar tool to Granite View available for Vermont? And my answer to that would be I'm not aware of any current tools that are available here in Vermont, but I think that the model that Katie is showing us and the information, especially in the publication, is very relevant to Vermont. And Katie, looks like we have a comment from Sherry. Yes, please send the list of the 67 articles, and I would echo that. And I think perhaps what we could do is, I know Gwen is planning on sending out the recording of this webinar after the webinar today. So why don't we, Gwen, as a program, we can commit to sending out a PDF or at least a link maybe to that literature review if Katie's willing to provide it to us.
That sounds good. Yeah, I can provide you a link to both the literature review and the technical notes. Yep.
Great. And we have a comment here from Darren, just reminding folks that BioFinder is a tool that is comparable, although I'm not aware of it, that it includes a layer of trails to the extent that New Hampshire has done. But perhaps if there's anybody on from Fish and Wildlife who would like to share more resources that are available, please feel free to enter in the question box and we'll make sure to share that information out with participants. So thank you. That's the questions that I have for right now. I'll let you take it from here, Katie. Thanks.
Great, thank you. So I went through the Granite View. The data itself is also available for download from the state's GIS clearinghouse hosted at UNH. And so as I mentioned on the Fish and Game website, there is a guidebook. It's kind of a how-to guide on how to use the tool. And all the information I'm presenting today, including case studies, is in this document. So I invite you to check it out after the webinar ends. And so I'd like to just go through how to use the tool. So you begin with a property of interest, maybe your community town forest, and you want to start by identifying the access sites. Where's the parking? Where are the existing trails, if you have any? Are there existing access points, parking areas, or do you have some in mind that you want to include? And it's important to remember that for any GIS model, not all features can be mapped or distinguished from aerial photography or satellite image, things like that. So it's very important to walk the property, locate any features that a model might have missed, things like vernal pools, other rare plants, wetlands. And then, the wildlife is just one aspect of of an area, there may be scenic viewpoints that you would like to direct people to, or historic features on the property that may be of interest. And so adding all those to the maps and overlaying them on the heat map allows you to locate trails by following the blue. And again, the blue areas in this model represent the least impact to wildlife, while still providing access to the features of interest. And there is, for any GIS folks in the audience, there is a tool developed by the Nature Conservancy called Linkage Mapper, which will take and connect all of these, the access points and the destination points by following the least cost path. So you can think of least cost as having the least impact to wildlife. So just another tool in the tool chest out there. We can also, that's for locating new trails. We can also use it for evaluating existing trails. Here we've taken an existing trail network for one of our properties, overlaid it on the model, and we see that the majority of trails are actually pretty well located. They're not having a high impact on wildlife, and so they'll likely remain unaltered. There are a couple of trail segments on this particular property that are currently routed through highly sensitive areas, and they should be considered for either decommissioning or changing their location. One of the first projects that we applied this to was the Stonehouse Force. This is a property acquired by the Southeast Land Trust. It's just over 1,500 acres. So it's one of the largest undeveloped tracts in Barrington, New Hampshire, which is in the southeast part of the state. It had at the time of almost 10.5 miles of existing woods roads and trails. And so they were interested in knowing, which of these trails could be maintained in place, where could we create new ones, and which ones would be recommended for decommissioning. So they looked at the access points, the destinations, like the scenic views, areas of interest, and came up with a plan to maintain a lot of the trails as is, decommission some of the ones where they wanted to prevent access from adjacent private properties, to help control the access to be only from, designated parking areas, and remove, like in the north end of the property, remove a couple of the spur trails, which were approaching sensitive habitat areas. And so those were decommissioned. And so the present day trail network it has minimized the impacts to wildlife. It has a number of different uses. There's still multiple areas to access the property, and they've decided to keep some of the trails that had a higher impact were maintained in place just because of the condition, the size of the trail and its historic significance. And even just eliminating a couple of the short spur trails can have a large impact. This is a fish and game property. It currently has about 4.5 miles of existing trails. And if we include that corridor of influence, with 400 feet on either side of you, that leaves, it's influencing about 267 acres, almost 70% of the entire property, with the largest uninfluenced area at 38 acres. And by removing just 2 of the spur trails, shown highlighted in yellow on the left part of the slide here, we can increase that area to 93 acres, about 2.5 times the original area. And most people, when they're out hiking or biking, will tend to prefer loop trails anyhow. And so by decommissioning those spur trails, it just made sense in this case. And as I mentioned, wildlife is just one concern. So some trails, even if they're in higher impact areas, they don't make sense to move. This is the Lower Shaker Wildlife Management Area in Enfield. And 73% of the property was being influenced by the existing trail network. A number of those trails were decommissioned, reducing the network's influence by 21%. But you will see 1 or 2 trails in the middle of the property that still follow fairly high impact areas to wildlife. But these were maintained in place because historically they were sheep driving paths. And it was important to the community to maintain these areas. So once you've used the model, overlaid your trail network, or came up with a plan for creating new trails, it's always important to go and verify that plan with a field visit. And so just in an overview, you want to begin by mapping your existing features. Apply the trail location tool, which means follow the blue. And if you're creating new trails, plan the best route, or if it's an existing trail, decide which ones could be maintained, rerouted, or decommissioned. You can find out your impact by overlaying that corridor of influence, and then again, verify in the field when you're done the planning exercise.
Katie, it looks like we have a few questions that have come in specific to the map process. A question from Melinda: when the impact map was made through overlay analysis, was there any weighing to each layer, or was it straight addition?
No, it was a weighted sum, and the weights were determined by that working group where we had all the representatives from different organizations attend, and so it was by popular vote among the people who attended the workshop. I will say that the rare plants, sensitive habitats definitely got weighted higher than, for example, the steep slopes. So yes, it was a weighted sum, and that is described in the technical document.
Great, thank you so much. A question from Darren: has the New Hampshire literature considered whether and how wildlife adapt to regular disturbances by trail users? I wonder if that affects whether all trails are in the red areas need to be decommissioned or not.
Yeah, that's a good question. We did. There's definitely a lot of literature about that, and wildlife can become acclimated to our presence. Ironically, they can become acclimated to motorized recreation almost more quickly than to pedestrian recreation. But for this model, we did not look at, because we did not have the information, we did not look at visitor use or trail counts. All trail uses or trail use types were considered equally.
Great. I think that gets to the next question that I had from Len. Does frequency of use or time of day contribute to wildlife impact? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, there's obviously, we have had some studies done in the wintertime, for example, where certain wildlife species are able to take advantage of compacted snow and move into higher elevation areas where they wouldn't otherwise have access to. There's some great guidance if your trail happens to go past a known deer wintering area. There's some great guidance on how to maintain either a vegetated buffer or locate the trail to obscure the human activity from the deer wintering area. I don't know if that addresses what the person was asking.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing. And then just one last question, and then we'll let you move on. To what extent have different species adapted to trails with a longer history, like the sheep trail that you discussed? To what extent are heat maps ground truth or specific adaptations to specific trails?
Yeah, so the ground truthing has only been done on the basically a case study basis. So as organizations or communities have started using the model, they've had their own volunteers or members go out and ground truth the GIS model that we provided.
Great, thank you so much. I'll let you continue.
Sure. So a lot of land trusts or communities may own multiple properties, and you can use this tool not just for locating trails, but evaluating the property as a whole. And you may find that certain areas that have very high impact to wildlife, maybe you don't want to maybe you want to reduce the amount of human presence. And so we leave those as low impact properties. And others could be advertised as ambassador properties. A good example of this is the Great Bay Reserve and the New Hampshire Seacoast. They own about 90 properties, 4 of them which serve as high use ambassador properties, which are regularly advertised and people are encouraged to go and visit. They have others which do not have access and do not have trails because of the sensitive nature of the ecological communities or wildlife present on them. And so just to summarize that, the goal is to create a targeted network of trails that allow you to focus your resources efficiently, not just minimizing impact to wildlife, but it will also help you reduce maintenance costs in the long term. And I think as was mentioned at last week's forum, you may have properties or trails that people just don't even know about. And if they're not, if the trails are well located in areas that minimize disturbance to wildlife, you may want to publicize existing trails rather than developing new trails. So look at the collection of everything that you have in your town. We did have one town at Deerfield, New Hampshire, which added conservation easement language and took some of the key principles from this guide and came up with easement language for keeping unfragmented areas trail-free whenever possible, avoiding high-quality special habitats, avoiding those riparian and other sensitive areas. And so we recognize that enjoying wildlife is just one piece of the puzzle. People are also interested in certain types of recreation or historic resources. There's also some great guidance from the U.S. Forest Service for universally accessible trails. And we hope that using the 5 key principles will allow towns and organizations to enhance the wildlife viewing opportunities, even if the trails are serving other recreation purposes. And so in closing, we just encourage people to get outside, appreciate nature, and have fun. And I'd like to recognize the two people that helped create this project. The project leader is Rachel Stevens, who is the stewardship coordinator and wildlife ecologist with the Great Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve, and Jim Ayler, who is the habitat program supervisor here at New Hampshire Fish and Game. And with that, I thank everyone. That went a little quicker than previously, but I'm happy to answer additional questions or revisit the online map viewer if you like.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Katie, for sharing this great tool. And again, from our perspective here in Vermont, we look over to you guys and just appreciate all the work that you have done in pulling this together. It's just serves, I think, as a really exciting and helpful model to us in thinking about the interaction between trails and wildlife. So thank you so much for sharing today. We do have a few more questions that have come in, so let me go ahead and read those off. A question from Arlene. And I guess it's more of a comment / question. In Vermont, we'd have to map the sensitive areas and habitats ourselves in order to make the heat map. Arlene, that is correct. So this tool is based, is New Hampshire based. There currently is not a similar tool available here in Vermont, but in a second, after we get through some more of the questions, I want to just share a couple of quick tools just to orient folks to a couple of the tools that are here in Vermont that you might be interested in knowing about. There's a question here from Melinda. Let's see here. Again, I apologize. I'm sorry. I'm reading and I only saw part of that question. So again, Melinda, I'll talk about some of the Vermont-based resources here in a second. Let's see here. Here we go, Katie. Here's another question for you. Is there evidence that different types of non-motorized recreation impact wildlife differently?
Yes, there's been quite a bit of research comparing different, especially with birds. So they looked at people driving in a car versus riding a bike versus walking versus stopping to looking. And I know my two partners cringe when I say this, but they did discover that bird watchers can be one of the biggest impacts on wildlife. And if you think about it, it kind of makes sense. There's a nice little pond that I drive by every day on my way to work. And if I'm driving by, the birds down in that pond don't mind at all. But if I try to walk along the shoulder of the road with my binoculars or camera, there's a very visible disturbance to those birds. Many of them will take flight and leave. So yes, that's not included in this model, but there is definitely a lot of literature about that.
Well, Katie, it's almost like you anticipated one of the other questions that has come in from Margaret around the impact of overhead planes and other road noise. So it sounds like that was not considered as a part of the model. Is that correct?
That's correct. It's not. There is a lot of information out there, though. I'm sure Vermont has too. New Hampshire Fish and Game has looked at, some of the impacts of drones, for example. Now there's a lot of recreational drones flying around, and we do know that, for example, black bear, their heart rate will increase when a drone is being flown overhead. So I guess it's just important to remember that although the animal may not visibly be responding to your presence, and you think you're having no impact, there are some physiological responses that are happening that aren't necessarily as observable by us.
Interesting. Another question from Margaret. What do you recommend resource managers do to reduce informal or social trails that may still be created in sensitive areas?
Yeah, that's definitely tricky. We certainly have some properties here in New Hampshire, and we keep brushing in the trails, and a week or two later, the people will come back and remove all the brush. What we've found is that signs help. So in addition to brushing in the trail, putting up a sign explaining why the trail's being closed, that, that the trail's through an ecologically sensitive area and we're asking people to avoid it, seems to have helped.
Great. A question about dogs from Heidi. A dog was mentioned earlier in the presentation. This is a big question for our town trail in Salisbury. How does allowing dogs on trails impact wildlife?
Yeah, so it's great. We certainly encourage, New Hampshire Fish and Game has some properties where we know we have, for example, grassland birds, ground nesting birds. And so during that spring breeding season, we require dogs be leashed. And there are a few, not on our properties, but there have been a couple other community areas where they actually have a leash loan program. And so when you arrive in the parking lot, there's a little kiosk where if you forgot to bring a leash for your dog, you can borrow one for the day. And it's certain times of the year, it's definitely important to keep your dogs on leash if they're not under voice control.
What a great idea. I love it. Another question here on existing trails that impact wildlife. Does New Hampshire implement seasonal restrictions, say during nesting season?
Yeah, there is only one location that I'm familiar with where there's a bald eagle nest and the trail is closed during the nesting season and then reopened after the young eagles have fledged. I think you just have to approach that on a site by site basis.
And a follow-up question around the dog issue. Karen is interested in best practices for allowing dogs, for example, leash versus voice control. What is the time frame for leashes requiring leashes during nesting season?
That's a good question. You're asking an IT specialist, so I may have to postpone that answer and maybe ask my biologist colleagues, but I believe it would be required definitely during the months of May and June. I think it may be April 15th to July 15th at the longest extents.
Great, thank you so much. And I think it depends a little bit on species of concern, I would imagine.
Yes.
It seems like a good maybe follow-up webinar to bring in our wildlife experts. Let's see here, a few more questions. Then feel free, folks, to keep them coming in. I really appreciate all the questions that have come in so far. Let's see here, a question from John around bobcats. Bobcats are very sensitive to dog presence, especially during the birth and denning seasons. March 1st through June 15th in my area. A comment, just the scent of them can prevent bobcats from denning in a certain area. Looks like that was a comment from John. And then another question here, are official trails that still go through sensitive areas being managed differently? Do visitors know that they're sensitive areas? For example, are there signs up or requests for fewer visitors?
Right now, no. There have been a couple of cases where the trails have been decommissioned, at least on the state properties, if we know that they're having a severe impact in sensitive areas. The application of this tool is all very new to within the past year. So.
Okay, great. Well, it looks like that's it for questions. Again, Katie, thank you so much for sharing this really exciting and important work out of New Hampshire. We really appreciate you taking the time to join us. And from my perspective, really seems like New Hampshire is leading the way in terms of doing some of this research, and so it's really wonderful to see what you guys are doing across the border, and I think again really serves as an exciting model for us here in Vermont to be thinking about these issues. So thank you so much for joining us, and I just before we wrap up the webinar today, I'm just going to go ahead and grab my screen because there's been a number of questions regarding the tools that are available here in Vermont. So I just wanted to quickly show folks, if you're not aware, we do have some resources here in Vermont, obviously nowhere near as extensive as the work that Katie and her team has done in New Hampshire. But I want to show you the quick BioFinder tool. This is an excellent tool out of the Agency of Natural Resource. Many of you probably are very familiar with it already, but provides an online mapping system for understanding Vermont's biodiversity. And so if folks are interested in understanding a little bit about the natural resources in their town forest, or some of the ecosystems that Katie mentioned, and some of the resources that you might want to manage around, BioFinder is an excellent tool to help you look at your town forest parcel and understand what's currently known about the natural resources there. So I just wanted to quickly highlight that as a tool for folks here in Vermont. And then also, as many of you know, if you participated in the webinar last week, as part of our town forest recreation planning project, one of the resources that we created was actually a natural resource guidelines for recreation planning in town forests. And this document, although it's not map-based or nowhere near as cool as the work that Katie and her team has been doing, does provide some general guidance on planning for trails around natural resources. So for example, it talks a little bit about how far of a buffer you should consider around a vernal pool, or thinking about deer wintering areas, which Katie mentioned, sort of planning for siting trails around these resources, and so what some of those best practices are. So those are just two of the resources here that are Vermont based that I wanted to just quickly share. But again, thank you so much, Katie, for joining us today. Really appreciate all of the information that you shared, and we look forward to learning more as we share out the recorded webinar from today, and also the documents that you referred to in your presentation. So with that, if there are no other questions, I'll go ahead and wrap up the webinar for today, and just remind folks that this is part of an ongoing webinar series. And so next week, please consider joining us at Tuesday at 10 o'clock again for our third webinar in the series on connecting downtowns with trails for economic vibrancy. So with that, thank you again, Katie, for taking the time to join us today. Thank you, everybody, for participating, and hope everybody has a great day.
Great, thanks, everyone.